There are parts of the drive up to the national park atop Haleakala that start to feel a little otherworldly. Your car is angled up and you're climbing fairly quickly, and you can lose sight of the true horizon before you crest a hill. It can be a little disorienting, and if you are climbing rapidly and susceptible to altitude issues, it may cause problems for you as you're driving. Those effects of altitude can be incredibly potent, and they can come on quickly. Best practice at these high altitudes is, of course, to stop and park in order to avoid driving unsafely. For Lieutenant Alkonis, descending Mount Fuji, stopping and parking simply wasn't an option. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. This case grabbed my attention when it happened in 2021 and remained of interest, sort of lurking in the background, a little bit unresolved. Even when a guilty plea came out, it still felt unfinished, but this seems like a good time to circle back. Navy Lieutenant Ridge Alkonis was stationed at Yokosuka Naval Base just south of Tokyo. He was excited to be back in Japan. He'd spent 2 years in Japan when he was a young man, a missionary for what I'm assuming is the Mormon Church, based on context clues. In his first 2 years in Japan, he'd learned the language and fallen in love with the culture. But after serving that time as a missionary, Alkonis returned to the United States, attended the Naval Academy, and joined the fleet. Like many service members stationed in Japan in 2021, he, his wife, and his 3 children explored wherever they could while international travel was forbidden. On May 29, 2021, the family drove up to Mount Fuji for a morning hike and began to wind their way down the mountain to return to Yokosuka. It's undisputed that at about 1 p.m., while Alkonis was behind the wheel of the family minivan, he became incapacitated and crashed into pedestrians and parked cars outside a restaurant in Fujinomiya. Everyone also agrees that there were no drugs or alcohol involved in the crash. But that crash killed an 85-year-old woman on the scene. Her 54-year-old son-in-law succumbed to his injuries a few days later, widowing his wife, who was also injured in the accident. Alkonis was taken into custody and detained for 26 days before Japanese prosecutors charged him. I mentioned it in 51, Japan v. Gadsden, but when someone is arrested in Japan, they don't have the right to remain silent. That is, if a defendant remains silent, their silence can and will be used against them in their later prosecution. It's like if I ask my spouse how he likes the dinner I cooked. If he says nothing when offered the opportunity, I'll assume the worst and proceed as such. Except liking or disliking a meal doesn't have deprivation of liberty implications. What all this mushes together to mean is that a person in custody in Japan is usually subject to long, repeated interrogations, giving them multiple opportunities to provide information, giving them multiple opportunities to have their silence used against them. Alkonis explained that he'd fainted as a result of altitude sickness brought on by the family's hike. His family reported he'd been in the middle of a conversation when he passed out mid-sentence. They said his daughter kicked at his seat from behind him, but Alkonis couldn't be roused. They also reported that he did not wake up until sometime after the accident. Impact wasn't even able to startle him awake. This would seem to be consistent with the naval doctor's conclusion that he lost consciousness due to acute mountain sickness, that his sickly pallor upon waking was consistent with someone who'd fainted. As someone who gets woozy in hospitals, I'm very familiar with the clammy grogginess that comes with coming to. But as Japanese prosecutors maintained and charged, Alkonis fell asleep at the wheel. They advanced a narrative that he could have prevented the fatal accident if he had only stopped minutes before the accident when he began to feel drowsy. It seems that some of the charging decision was based on the low elevation of the incident site, just 300 meters above sea level. The surviving Japanese family members brought a civil suit against Alkonis. Alkonis formally apologized and paid a monetary settlement to them. And this is something that I want to pause on briefly. While we were living in Japan, we became familiar with the concept of a gomenasai payment. The payments are a way to say, "I'm sorry, please forgive me," and they are a culturally accepted practice of monetarily compensating somebody after an accident. Friends who lived off base shared that they'd received a gomenasai payment from their landlord after a planned water outage to perform maintenance. Fender benders were another common predecessor to gomenasai payments. But in coverage of this case, the Japan Times explicitly clarified, there is no such traditional term, gomenasai, to refer to compensation payments. They highlight instead that there is a cultural practice of paying money to victims and that tradition is referred to as ishiryo. I have almost no confidence in my pronunciation, which may be a contributing factor to how we ended up with two different names for what might be the same practice. But the accident Alkonis was involved in, the accident in which he was behind the wheel, wasn't a minor fender bender. It was a crash that killed 2 people and injured a third. Accordingly, it's been reported that his payment to the family was approximately $1.65 million. It was and remains the largest such payment by an American service member. Consistent with his plea, his apology, and his payment, Alkonis' lawyers expected him to receive a suspended sentence, a sentence that would not require he spend additional time in a Japanese prison. Instead, the judge found Alkonis was fatigued and acted irresponsibly by continuing to drive down the mountain, and sentenced Alkonis to 3 years in custody. That prison sentence became a flashpoint for the relationship between the United States and Japan. For the Japanese, this felt like yet another infringement on their safety and security because of American service members stationed there. For Americans, it felt like Alkonis got hometowned and received a harsher sentence than locals would have because he wasn't from there. In a survey of Japanese locals, 92% reported they believed the U.S. held the dominant position in the U.S.-Japanese relationship, while just 6% considered the countries equal. The greatest source of goodwill was the rapid military mobilization following the March 2011 earthquake and tsunami, Operation Tomodachi. But that goodwill gets chipped away at, as base-adjacent communities experience service members more directly, both the good and the bad. For more information about how that can shake out, I'd again direct you to episode 51. For Alkonis' wife, Brittany, and their 3 children, I imagine it felt like a wildly uncertain future. Not knowing when they would next see Alkonis, and not knowing whether they could or should stay in Japan to be near him during his incarceration. Brittany was a powerful advocate and began lobbying their elected officials. Perhaps her staunchest ally, Utah Senator Mike Lee, condemned the way Japan handled the case and demanded they face consequences and extend an apology. He railed against how America's friend and ally Japan treated Alkonis, saying it's no way for Japan to treat someone who was protecting Japan. Before we consider the merits of a statement like that, it is perhaps worth observing for those in the legal community that Lee managed to clerk for now Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito twice, first at the Circuit Court and again at the Supreme Court. That fact may provide additional high-level background on Lee, a vocal advocate for overturning the results of the 2020 election. But returning to the issue at hand, the American relationship with Japan, I think Lee's view that service members stationed in Japan are there for Japan's protection is an overly simple and borderline untruthful view of the role of American service members. Sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines aren't stationed in Japan simply to offer some friendly protection. Large swathes of the country were seized following World War II, not unlike Germany. The bloody battles in the Pacific Island hopping campaign forever altered the islands, and the United States didn't simply pull back and leave everyone to their business. Okinawa, for instance, was captured in 1945 and was placed under U.S. military control. It didn't return to Japanese control until May 15, 1972, and suddenly everybody had to learn how to drive on the left side of the road and the right side of the car. Even now, the United States maintains 120 bases across Japan. The bases provide an American military advantage in the Pacific region. A forward projection of strength should those in the region get any ideas about expanding their borders in ways that threaten the United States or whatever allies remain. The various airstrips can host surveillance flights in times of peace or serve a darker daily mission in times of war. The naval bases and ports serve as safe harbor for the Pacific Fleet. Which is all to say, I think it's a little disingenuous to describe service members stationed there as protecting Japan. It's not something the Department of Defense is doing just to be nice. And if you think this is an overstatement of the regional concerns, those concerns are not ours alone to bear. Japan recently doubled its defense spending in the midst of its largest military buildup since World War II. In July 2022, the Japanese appellate court rejected Alkonis' appeal, effectively affirming the sentence and conviction. In early 2023, Brittany attended President Biden's State of the Union address, where she continued to press for her husband's release. She took the opportunity to make a direct and personal appeal to Biden to work to get Alkonis home. There's a really striking photo of President Biden embracing Brittany after the State of the Union that I'll be sure to share on the Conduct Unbecoming Instagram feed. Consistent with Biden's focus on bringing home Americans detained abroad, President Biden and then Vice President Harris personally worked to secure Alkonis' transfer to a detention center in Los Angeles. He arrived in December 2023, and approximately 1 month later, he was released from custody following an American Parole Commission's review of the case file regarding the crash. He served approximately half of his sentence. During his more than 500 days in prison, Alkonis read 192 books and learned to sew and tailor clothing. Triumphant articles splashed photos of Alkonis reuniting with his family. But in the wake of his return, the Secretary of the Navy declined to promote him, citing the guilty plea and conviction. He was assigned to Naval Personnel Command while he reintegrated to life on the outside, and ultimately left the Navy in October 2024. I found this case a bit difficult to cover. Not because the content was overwhelmingly disturbing. I think I've talked about much more disturbing fact patterns. but more so from the perspective that everyone agrees this was not an intentional act. And it's really hard to figure out what penalty someone should face for an accident. It's tough to balance the knowledge that Alkonis had no intention of hurting anybody and that he may have passed out due to acute mountain sickness, with the fact that 2 people died. I don't know what the right outcome is or should have been. Whether Alkonis should have served prison time, whether that should have been in Japan or here in the United States. But a representative from New York argued that going forward, the United States must ensure our service members abroad have the same legal protections as they do at home, specifically citing due process. Speaking only for myself, this is a laughable pipe dream. I don't imagine it would be well received by our allies to have America try and change the way that they pursue criminal justice. Perhaps I can state that more directly. I find it patently absurd to think that the United States, in our current posture, has the space to go bang on the bully pulpit and assert that the Japanese violated rights that our Department of Justice seeks to strip people of at home. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we discuss 2 different cases with similar seasoning. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.